Hey, I'm Laura. Just quickly, we here at GRITtv are proud to bring you independently produced content every day. Now it's your chance to help us. GRITtv has been offered a $100,000 challenge grant. Every dollar you give right now between now and June 30th is worth $3 to us. We've only got a few more weeks to meet the match. Will you help? You can donate at our website, GRITtv.org. Meanwhile, enjoy this clip. Well, first off, popular anger is clearly on display. So what is a sitting president to do? You don't have to listen too hard to hear at least one answer. Act on popular needs of jobs and housing and profit makers who kill. People are hurting while profits are soaring, and the scars are all over the land. With primaries past, attention may now return to that other big story in this country right now, the BP oil spill. But our next guest says the problem is endemic. Even before the Deep Horizon rig exploded, huge swaths of the Gulf had become oxygen-starved dead zones, due not to oil, but to runoff from industrial farms. Big oil, big agribusiness, there's an opportunity for big politicians to act here. Are they going to do it? Meanwhile, this goes on. Nothing seems to have stopped under the ocean in the Gulf, where that pipe of British Petroleum and Transocean keeps belching oil. No matter what BP says about having inserted a pipe that will siphon away the waste, it's not happening, at least not if new videos out today are anything to go by. Unfortunately, the dead zones that are pending in the Gulf of Mexico are nothing new. With us to talk about it, David Kirby. He's the author of Animal Factory. Welcome back to the program, David.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's talk about it. I mean, people have been chilled by the footage, and then this week we're reassured by the news that at least some of the oil seemed to be being siphoned away. What do you make of what's going on, and what is a dead zone exactly?
Well, first of all, about siphoning away, it's like sticking a straw in Niagara Falls, isn't it? I think you're going to solve the problem. I could have come up with a better solution. But
I wish you would.
It's astounding to me how incompetent these people are, and the lack of outrage and the lack of oversight from the government. They should be there. The military should. Someone should go there and plug that thing. There's got to be a way to do it. A dead zone is basically where something comes and sucks the oxygen out of the water. It's usually an algae bloom, but also in the case of petroleum, it can do the same thing, therefore killing all marine life that lives in that area. And there's a dead zone that blooms every summer in the Gulf. Of course, you know, the news anchors don't fly down there to cover that, but it's been happening every year, and I write about it in my book, in Animal Factory. And that's from nutrients coming down the Mississippi River and being expelled into the Gulf. Phosphorus and nitrogen, which feeds algae blooms, which causes the dead zones. Most of that, as you said, is coming from runoff from industrial farms, large grain and corn farms that use petrochemicals, by the way, to fertilize the ground. And that's so it's basically oil products coming back into the Gulf. And then large animal farms, poultry, dairy, and pig farms that over-apply animal manure onto the land, or sometimes their lagoons actually burst or overflow, get into the waterways, and that watershed, the Mississippi watershed, is huge. It goes from Montana to Pennsylvania. So all of that comes out of the Gulf.
These dead zones are nothing new.
Unfortunately, no. And they happen in other places as well.
Talk about the implications for humans. We hear a lot about mammal life, and I'm worried about mammal life and fish, you name it. But there's also what we know from pesticides, a course that these chemicals take, usually ending up in our water supply. How's it happen?
In our water supply, or also on our food and in our food. And we should talk about that as well as it relates to meat and milk and things like that. But again, from runoff, a lot of it comes, especially people who get groundwater, well water, pesticides and things like nitrates, again, from runoff from animal manure. It seeps through into the water table, and there's, soil has a way of draining itself. That's what water does. That's how water gets into the water table. And if it's contaminated with pesticides or nutrients or nitrates, that too will get into the water table.
So were you worried? I mean, I look at the geology of the Gulf Coast, and you've got a lot of low-lying areas there. It's not just the oil on the surface of the land that I'm worried about, but that oil could take the same trajectory as some of these pesticides have and end up in the water table and worse.
If it gets into inland water sources, absolutely that could happen. It could pollute all kinds of wetlands. I hope they at least try to prevent it from getting into the marsh area, the estuaries, because that's where most coastal life begins, in the estuaries.
So as somebody who's been following agribusiness all this time, watching this story on the Gulf, what's your reaction? I mean, part of you must just be saying, you guys haven't been paying attention. It shouldn't take a spill of this proportion to get us to notice the threats that are out there from big business to our water and land.
It shouldn't. And I write about in the book how we violate the laws of nature, and we think that our technology is going to protect us. And factory farming is the same way. Factory farming has produced mad cow disease and MRSA and swine flu. And these are warnings from nature that you cannot cram too many animals into one confinement and not expect something to happen. Well, you can't go into the middle of the ocean and drill haphazardly and without all the right restrictions without something terrible happening. But it's depressing because 60% of the American people still favor offshore oil drilling. So we might have another big disaster in farming, and the American people will still say, no, I want my cheap food. I want my cheap gas, I want my cheap food, and I don't care what happens hundreds of miles away.
But they may be getting things they don't want with all that cheap food and cheap gasoline.
It's not so cheap, is it?
Take a look at this news report from Fox News.
This is straight out of the journal Pediatrics. Researchers believe it only takes a small bit of the chemical to increase a child's risk of ADHD. The reason why is still a bit of a mystery, but here's what we do know. Researchers studied more than 1,100 kids between the ages of 8 and 15. 1 in 10 were thought by a parent to have ADHD. After crunching the numbers, researchers found the risk of having ADHD went up based on how much of the pesticide was in the child's system.
Attention deficit disorder and pesticides?
Absolutely, it makes perfect sense. If you read the science, these organophosphates, and by the way, they're very synergistic with heavy metals as well, they attack and inhibit certain chemicals in the brain that are absolutely necessary for memory and attention and learning. And people with Alzheimer's disease have inhibition of those chemicals, and it's been shown that these pesticides can do that.
So let's talk, if there are so many popular reasons for people to be outraged and so much need for action, about what kind of action you expect, or do you expect any action from the president on this? Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, as we're speaking, writes that this is an opportunity for the president to do something good. On the other hand, his very own Interior Secretary is implicated in some of the regulation-free drilling permits that were granted to the folks in the Gulf. How's the Ag Secretary and the EPA on some of these things?
I would say better, and I would also say that the Interior Secretary works for the President, so the President can tell him what to do. Let's not forget, it's not his autonomous decision. They've been trying to crack down on factory farm pollution, on some of the more anti-competitive business practices. There are some practical things that Obama campaigned on in the Iowa caucuses. He ran on an anti-factory farm platform, won. That's why he's president today, because he won Iowa. He wouldn't be if he didn't. And some simple things that are actually quite conservative, such as cutting subsidies to those giant corn and grain farms in the Midwest that are polluting the Gulf, that go to feed the animals in these factory farms, plus direct subsidies to the big factory farms themselves. Put in a ban on processing plants owning the animals that they process so that independent farmers can get their animals to market. Ban the use of antibiotics in settings other than when you have a sick animal. And I would say enact a federal animal welfare rule that prohibits some of the cruelest confinements and allow an animal to have more space. That way, A, you won't need the antibiotics, they'll be healthier, less stressed out, and it's more humane, it's a better business practice.
Well, I look forward to bringing you back, David, and talk more. I think there are a lot of parallels between our agriculture problem, our agribusiness problem, and our big oil problem. We'll talk about it. David Kirby's the author of Animal Factory. You can find out more at our website, GRITtv.org.